Produced by Tomoyuki Tanaka. Directed by Ishiro Honda. Special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya. Scored by Akira Ifukube. With scenario penned by Shigeru Kayama. This black and white Japanese film, Gojira, starred Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka as the titular creature with a supporting cast of Akira Takarada, Momoko Kochi, Takashi Shimura, and Akihiko Hirata. It was a stark metaphor for the destruction of war, the dangers of nuclear power, and unforgiving natural disasters. Originally released in 1954, it was then recut for American audiences with new scenes of Raymond Burr as international reporter Steve Martin, and released in 1956 as Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
A prehistoric monster the Japanese call Godzilla has just walked out of Tokyo Bay. He's as tall as a 30-story building.
Surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror. Raging through the streets on a rampage of total destruction. All modern weapons fail. Is this the end of our civilization? Can the scientists of the world find a way to stop this creature? Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
Calling all podcasters. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you a special bulletin, reporting live from the We Can Make This Work, probably podcast network. We are receiving reports of, well, what can only be described as a gigantic ape rampaging through the streets of New York City. Wait, this just in. According to our overseas correspondents, there's been a confirmed sighting of a massive reptilian creature off the coast of Japan. Oh, the humanity! If you have any information regarding these two Goliath monsters or their film franchises, please record on your dictaphone and post or telegraph your audio transmission to us at probablywork.com. Please, hurry. Time is running out. We've just been told that the mayor is evacuating the city and the president is dispatching military forces. I don't know how to describe what I'm looking at, dear listeners. They appear to be squaring off. Jeez. This is it, people. The battle of the century. It's Godzilla versus Kong. A fire-breathing lizard takes on the giant angry ape. In this, a no-holds-barred clash between the king of the monsters and the titan of Skull Island. Who will come out on top? Why are they fighting? How did that monkey get so big? Find out on the latest season of Podcasters Assemble, Kongzillathon.
Podcasters Assemble!
Podcasters 集合!
This is Joseph Vigolier of the Godzilla podcast.
This is Toroidal Power from the Power Playthroughs podcast.
Hey, this is Chris Carroll from the Comic Zombie podcast.
This is Justin Aki, graphic designer and one half of Significant Article.
Yo, this is Corey from The World Is My Burrito.
Greetings, podcasters. This is Steve Whitcamp, also known as Mr. Alarm from geek2geekmedia.com.
Eric Slater here from Epic Fails of History and Too Young for This Trek.
I'm Stephen White. I'm the co-host of the Super Mega Crash Brothers Turbo podcast.
I'm Robert Kelly, host and writer of Record All Monsters.
Given my quick word on Godzilla 1954 / Godzilla King of the Monsters 1956.
And I'm here to talk to you about 1954's Godzilla and 1956's Godzilla King of the Monsters.
Just sharing some of my thoughts on the 1954 film Godzilla, also known as Gojira.
I'm here to talk about Godzilla, or Gojira as it's known in Japan, 1954 version.
And I'm watching the 56 King of the Monsters edit.
And I've just watched Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
The first time I saw the original Godzilla film was... I didn't even know it existed, frankly. I was looking through the DVDs shelves probably in 2005-ish, after the first iteration of the original movie came out on DVD in the United States.
Okay, so we are talking about 1954's Gojira, or Godzilla, from Toho Films.
I believe I saw it on a shelf somewhere titled Gojira, or however they pronounce it in Japan.
So in getting to start to talk about this movie, there has to be a clear distinction. Are we talking about the original Japanese version that was released in 1954, or are we talking about the Americanized version that was released in 1956?
This is my first time seeing this film ever.
I'm not sure when I saw either version, but I've seen 56 about 3 times and 54 at least a dozen.
Me personally, I'm going to be referring to the 1954 version.
I never was a Kaiju fan. It always seemed so corny to me.
Jumping ahead 20 years and some change from King Kong, and honestly, I think Kong's a good bit better.
Now, in regards to the Americanized version, the first time I saw that one was probably when I was a teenager, when TNT used to do Monster Vision.
And the first time I saw this movie was actually as a child. I randomly stumbled upon it on TV one day and became very much obsessed with monster movies, particularly Japanese monster movies as a result.
This movie, now I see why people just love this type of crap.
I saw that and I was like, hold on now. The original 1954 masterpiece is what it said on there. And I had to get that thing, and I watched it, and I was not let down. It was a fantastic, fantastic watch. Even as like a budding film nerd back when I was a teenager, I just saw it and I knew that like this was not only the Godzilla that I knew and loved from when I was a younger child, but also this was like a serious film. And I really appreciated that aspect of it.
I would take the newspaper every Sunday and go through the TV listings to see if there were any other Godzilla movies, which at the time, this was probably the late 80s, there were occasionally they would play some of the Showa era Godzilla movies on TV, so I would get my parents to get a VHS tape ready and record it, and I would just watch these movies on repeat. My favorite of them was Mothra vs. Godzilla, which is just, to this day, is still my favorite in the series, but man, I just could not get enough of Godzilla or Gamera as a child, so very excited to be talking about this original movie.
So I didn't watch the original Gojira. I watched the, I guess it's an American re-release from a few years later, starring Raymond Burr.
Of course, we didn't think this was the original Godzilla film here in the United States. I know when I was a kid, in the early days of the internet, reading about how, they brought Raymond Burr over to film the original Japanese version of Godzilla. We didn't realize we didn't even have the real version of Godzilla. What we had was the B-movie re-edit with the spliced-in Raymond Burr 1956 film, Godzilla King of the Monsters.
First of all, I'm fairly certain most of this episode's contributors will extol the virtues of Ishiro Honda's 1954 masterwork.
The Americanized version is not a clear dub-over. I mean, there are clear distinctions between the two, and I want to talk about the superior version.
Now, I think I lost out because I did see the 1956 version, the American one.
The original Japanese version of the film, I believe, is not a flawless film, but is an incredibly powerful film and can be seen as such, even more so through the eyes of history. And not only what happened, 10 years before with the nuclear attacks upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the Lucky Dragon incident, which was a huge influence on the movie.
The 1954 version, the original Japanese version, first time I saw that was probably in 2003, 2004. There was a local theater that would actually regularly show independent films or things like that, and they were showing a screening of this version of the film. I can't remember why. I think it was maybe an anniversary for Godzilla that year. It's 1954, 2004. That sounds about right.
Of course, we have to point out that the only version available to most Americans at the time was the King of the Monsters version, which is pretty heavily edited.
Apparently the 1954 Japanese version talked more about the bombs themselves and man.
So this was the first time that not only would I get to see this version of Godzilla before, but the first time I could actually see a legitimate Japanese version of Godzilla in theaters.
Is more of a morality tale.
And that is right and just.
The first thing to note is that there's two very distinct versions of this movie.
The American version I watched was just the story of a monster destroying Tokyo.
And they're both good.
But sometimes, when it comes to Terry Morse and Josephine Levine's 1956 US import version, I find myself in the role of John the Baptist, the lone voice crying out in the desert.
Actually,
this movie's pretty good, and also was completely necessary at the time.
I just rewatched the King of the Monsters version recently, and not a big fan. I think it's a little bit too dry. It takes a lot of the emotional drama and weight from the movie, but beggars couldn't be choosers, so I took what I could get as a child and watched King of the Monsters repeatedly.
The main difference of note is that the original Japanese version is a lot darker and more somber, leaning heavily into the anti-war messages, and especially the anti-atomic rhetoric of the time.
This is big for a lot of reasons. I mean, before I'd actually seen it, I had heard numerous times that, this had different meaning, that the Japanese version had different scenes, so on and so forth. So I was very curious to see what it was. What I didn't realize is how impactful the movie would be, and really, really understanding why Godzilla is the icon he is, because he's so ingrained in Japanese culture. And some might wonder why, after watching this movie, if you don't understand why this character can be so important in so many ways, this may actually give you an understanding as to why.
Looking at the foreign film landscape in America today, you might be tempted to think that it was sometime around the birth of the Criterion Collection that it occurred to Western distributors to simply subtitle movies not made in English when releasing them in English-speaking markets. This is not the case. No, as a matter of fact, subtitling was incredibly common. I go into the reasons in more depth in the third full episode of Record All Monsters, but that was also detrimental to a film's box office potential. So when Joseph Levine saw Godzilla and decided to distribute it in the US, he knew changes to this uniquely Japanese film would be necessary to make it work for an American audience in the mid-1950s.
If you've not seen either film, watch 54 first. 56 has a charm, but is devoid of any real meaning.
The reason I watch this version and not the original is just because I have a child and I'm usually hanging out with him while I try and watch stuff, which makes watching something subtitled impossible. So I went for the King of the Monsters American release just because it was in English. That was the only reason.
Totally understand why they made those changes, but I'm also happy that we have a choice nowadays to watch the original version, which is vastly superior in my opinion.
And I think it's better and better on each rewatch.
The name Gojira actually means gorilla whale in Japanese. There's also a conflicting account about Gojira being named after a big burly dude on set. So who knows the real origin of the name?
Now let's talk the story, because this story is very important. Now, I'm going to use King Kong as a good comparison piece, because when we got King Kong, we all know that, he was the godfather of the Kaiju film, hypothetically, depending on how you want to define that. 1933 giant monster movie, a love story which ends in tragedy, which, like most good love stories do. But this is not a replication of that. This is using the monster as a metaphor.
I forget who, but I think it was either Honda or Tsuburaya owned an original copy of King Kong. Keep in mind, Kong was out of existence after 33. You couldn't just buy a VHS or a DVD or anything. You had to own a reel if you wanted this film.
And it's also made even more fascinating by the effect that Godzilla had on film history, especially Japanese film history with Japanese science fiction. The giant monster genre from Japan, which we all call kaiju movies, was born with Godzilla as far as we know. There have been talks about some giant monster films coming out before Godzilla in Japan, but those films have not survived. So it's at the very least the oldest surviving kaiju film, and definitely the most important.
Originally, they wanted to emulate the stop-motion effects from 1933's King Kong, but they didn't have the time or budget to do it effectively, so they created suitmation.
It's interesting to think about, at least I'm thinking about it this way, is without King Kong, would we have Godzilla? Not because you can't have one without the other, but the idea was there. The concept was there. But would he be the character he is as presented, as we all know and love him? Or would it be some other amalgamation of caricature, some metaphor that he's supposed to be without King Kong? Because he was partially an inspiration, just like the beast from 20,000 Fathoms was an inspiration. You combine those two and then boom, you get Godzilla, hypothetically. But would that have been possible without King Kong? I don't know.
And what's interesting, what sets this kaiju film apart from the others that follow, is that Godzilla, even more so than King Kong, which King Kong has some scary parts, but it's kind of an action movie, Godzilla is a horror movie. And it's dealing with very dark, very heavy subjects through the monster of Godzilla as sort of a metaphorical force in the middle of the film. Let's add on top of that a really solid human drama dealing with questions about like technology and whether or not man should ever be allowed to use weapons of mass destruction on other people. You know, throw that in there and you have a movie that is seriously well thought out.
But I keep saying metaphor, and that's huge in this movie, because Godzilla is a metaphor for the atom bomb.
Which is culturally and historically significant considering this was less than a decade after World War II and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
He is the personification of that chaos and destruction that the Japanese people had seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this, if you think about this, this is only 10 years removed from that event. So this is pretty clear on their minds. You know, this is still pervading all the destruction, everything, the chaos that went along with it. It's all there.
Going back to the war and the bomb stuff that Godzilla represents so well, an interesting bit of trivia is that Godzilla's skin and the texture of his skin and the scales is meant to resemble keloid scars from survivors of the atomic bombings in Japan, and that's just another really dark thing that once you know it, once you see it, it's really hard to unsee it, and it adds to the gravity of that movie and what Godzilla symbolizes really well.
And all of the characters, in some way, shape, or form, are reflecting on that.
The design was inspired by combining the features of different iconic dinosaurs. The creators adapted Disney's method of using storyboards to plan out the film. The original Godzilla suit was too stiff for the actor to move because of the way the latex had hardened, so they had to redesign it from scratch. And the completed suit that ended up in the movie was still super heavy, the actor could barely see, and they even had to drain buckets of sweat between takes. I really like how the American version starts at the aftermath.
Through the lens of an ineffectual American reporter.
This whole narration is very Twilight Zone, in the best way.
And I actually think, like, Raymond Burr's performance is pretty good.
Props for the beginning of this movie starting with scenes from the end, and with a bloodied Raymond Burr at that.
Which, as a kid, I always thought that was the original one. And I always liked it, King of the Monsters version, because it always had this, like, seriousness and heaviness to it, which a lot of it, not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it survived, I believe, from the original cut into the American recut. And it always had that kind of, like, feeling of, like, this movie is somehow above in terms of maybe theme and thought and more adult in tone, for sure, than those other Godzilla movies, which I loved for completely different reasons as a kid.
Despite its fallacies, I appreciate how dynamic the American edit is, with the order of events as opposed to being entirely linear.
I love the Godzilla theme so much. I like how in the Japanese version the credits play with the sound effects of Godzilla stomping through.
Once again, this Godzilla is a horror movie. It's like a dark, plotting horror movie.
We begin on the ocean. Catastrophe hits a Japanese boat.
Talk about shirking responsibility, this film never shows or says the name of the boat that was sunken by Godzilla.
Like in Kong, it takes a little while before we get to the monster. We see that there's some trouble going on in the ocean where a ship is kind of like incinerated while it's floating. Just kind of goes over the wrong spot of water. And then the rescue ship they send out in response to that also sinks. Then a fishing ship, which happens to be in the area, catches some floating survivors, and then cuts to like a relay station where we learn that they've also sank mysteriously. So we also hear that some other rescue boats and a helicopter were sent out. We don't really hear what happens to them, but we do see the wrecked helicopter on the shore later. So something fishy's going on.
In the American version, the story is narrated by foreign correspondent Steve Martin. No, not that Steve Martin. Played by Raymond Burr.
Who wasn't in the original Godzilla movie.
Raymond Burr brings a believable gravitas to his role as international reporter Steve Martin,
who just so happens to be friends with Dr. Serizawa.
And while his integration into the story isn't always seamless,
they just went and filmed Raymond Burr and put him all over in Godzilla.
I didn't have any issues with it at the time. I thought it was just how the movie originally was made, with Raymond Burr constantly appearing to discuss matters with the Japanese people in peril, and the love triangle stuff was kind of put more as a background plot than in the original version.
Even though rewatching the American edit after seeing the Japanese one, you certainly get like a sense of there's some sort of silliness, he's spliced in there almost like Kung Pao style. And it's kind of awkward, but you didn't know that when you were watching it as a kid, or probably even adults watching it over the last, between 1956 and 2004, when we actually got the original cut in the West. It seemed like it was like legitimate, like it was a really good B movie.
It's definitely well and artfully done.
Steve Martin has the worst timing in the world, flying into Japan at approximately the same time a juiced up lizard wakes up from a nap.
I love the scene where he calls up Serizawa and his face is obscured by beakers in the lab,
which is interesting.
And some kind of forced in shots where like Dr. Serizawa is talking to him on the cell phone, but he's like half his face is covered up. Like that stuff obviously doesn't work, especially on rewatches.
Steve's only connection to Japan is Dr. Serizawa, which I think was a fun decision because it forces him to spend so much time with other people while Serizawa is gone.
Actually, the most impressive part of this version I did see was the way they seemed in Raymond Burr with the existing cast, by using body doubles and probably using alternate takes from the original film. They built some new sets, and they used a lot of Japanese-American actors to fill up the space.
For the most part, they do a good job with the insert shots where he's talking to other characters.
Some stuff doesn't work, like the Japanese guy, yelling at him.
But man, some of the dubbing is real bad.
I think the dubbing, when it was just Japanese people, though, was terrible, especially for the mad scientist encounter.
The cheesiest thing about this one for me was the inclusion of Raymond Burr, because it was clear that it was all filmed after the fact, because most of the shots of Raymond Burr were just him standing like in the back of a crowd looking on with concern on his face. And it's just like, what are you doing there?
But I think actually what you have with the original Godzilla is you got a good solid A picture, and you got with Godzilla King of the Monsters a good solid B picture. Both are totally worth watching.
That's such a weird inclusion.
As a Westerner, it might even be worth watching Godzilla King of the Monsters first, so that you could appreciate that movie on its own.
We see, kind of the national hysteria starting to grow. No one knows what's going on yet. They don't know if it's some, monster or natural phenomena or an enemy nation. Nobody has any idea.
We meet Hideo Ogata and his fiancée Imiko.
Then, of course, there's the love story, which it seems like an afterthought, but I guess there's some reasons for that in the film.
Ogata is called away because of the incident and has to leave to investigate. Something happens to another boat. A few survivors are saved, they're badly burned. Was it a mine? An underwater volcano? A villager washes ashore in a fishing village and mutters something about a monster.
One of the best things about this movie is that it does build up to seeing the monster.
Definitely some good tension building.
It reminded me about Jaws.
At times it feels almost like Jaws, where you see like little snippets of him and they're building on the tension, but then it'll go like a long time without seeing him. And unfortunately, like Jaws, or unlike Jaws, I should say, this movie doesn't really have the compelling side character.
We don't see anything for about 30 minutes, just mysterious ships disappearing.
We see on a small island that there is a survivor floats ashore on a raft, like a kind of hastily thrown together raft. And he kind of just says, like, it got us before he, faints.
I was surprised. I don't know if it's just the version that I have, but for whatever reason, the Japanese-speaking parts in the American version were not subtitled.
Rather than dubbing or force subbing over every scene, this film puts the viewers in the exact same seat as Steve Martin. It plays through many of the original Japanese scenes and has Steve Martin's representative translate everything that's happening. Another really smooth touch.
An old man talks about a mythical creature called Gojira, a monster that lives in the sea and comes from the ocean to feed on mankind to survive. So this grandpa goes on to say that back in his day, they used to sacrifice girls to the creature. We see a traditional ceremony that is supposed to ward away the monster.
On Odo Island, the one thing in here that might have been better than the original is the progression of bad weather. It's such a slow gain that suddenly just hits very hard, and I think overall lasts longer from beginning to end.
Later that night, presumably, there's a huge storm on that same island, and it's wrecking houses and throwing crap everywhere.
The wind and rain howl outside. We see a building torn apart by something in the storm. People testify that it wasn't just a typhoon, but an animal of some kind. Professor Yamane, the paleontologist, is introduced and, with little to no evidence, claims that it may have been a dinosaur from deep within the Earth's crust.
Like most 50s monster movies, they're, pretty bland, pretty forgettable, except for, I guess, the scientist with the eye patch.
We're introduced to Dr. Serizawa, a mysterious scientist with an eye patch.
That's how we know he's different, because he has an eye patch.
Dr. Serizawa is still my favorite character.
I think the story of Dr. Serizawa is what honestly sets this Godzilla film apart from every other Godzilla film.
My favorite human character in all of the Godzilla movies.
I think the only other Godzilla film that kind of comes close to it on this adult level is honestly the newest live action Japanese Godzilla film at this point in time, which is Shin Godzilla. And Dr. Serizawa's story, even though it's a mad scientist story, which is of course, a trope.
But then we get to Dr. Serizawa, who he really speaks to the idea of the bomb, because you have to kind of put him in the shoes of those who actually created the atom bomb and the H-bomb.
He is just portrayed perfectly as this tortured genius who has the solution to the problem of Godzilla, but it also might cause more destruction if it were to be mishandled after dealing with the monsters.
Even within that context, he's in love and to his betrothed, and she's in love with another guy, and he has this secret that could, do immense damage to underwater ocean life, which will, of course, in turn damage human beings, and this horrible weapon that he's created.
Apparently, Serizawa is friends with Ogata and Imiko, which is convenient.
On the return to Odo Island, Steve narrates that Imiko, Ogata, and Serizawa are in a love triangle, with Imiko engaged to Serizawa but wanting to be with Ogata. It's a shame that so much character development was cut, because without this narration, you'd honestly never know.
But in the original movie, the love triangle between Dr. Serizawa, Hideto, and Emiko is so well done. It's actually effective, and even the stuff with the older doctor, Dr. Yamane, just all of the acting is superb.
We see the wrecked helicopter over by the island, and the next time we see the island, there's these government scientists there. They're kind of investigating the destruction.
It turns out that the water in the village is radioactive, and they find the footprint of a large creature, a radioactive footprint.
Little bit of trivia, one of these scenes where they're walking through a trashed village was just a painting placed in front of the camera. This film was very advanced for its time, and there are whole books on what it brought to the table.
And they're getting radioactive readings from certain areas where the destruction is the worst. And then they discover that this recess in the ground is actually the footprint of a giant animal, and that the footprint is radioactive.
And the professor finds what appears to be a trilobite, a prehistoric species that's been extinct for millions of years.
Gotta love how everyone just hangs out in a radioactive area, even after they're told it's dangerous and have already experienced what it can do to others.
And this is where we first see and hear Godzilla. They hear this, Jurassic Park style thumping footprints, and then you hear his, his ridiculous, awesome scream.
So the creature reappears on the other side of the mountain, and we can hear its footsteps as the villagers run for it.
Understandably, this is like Suitmation, one of the first movies to actually utilize this kind of concept, and it's serviceable. The little Godzilla puppet can be humorous at times, but I never really found myself laughing at it too much.
The goofiest moment.
Of course, we have the goofiest moment, which is, let's just say, derpy Godzilla peeking over the hills when he's first shown in the movie.
And you see his big, stupid, lopsided, mushy face. He looks so ridiculous.
I mean, every time they bring out the hand puppet for Godzilla's head, that's always a little bit goofy.
Maybe the one scene where he just kind of eyeballs the camera. I always found that to be kind of funny.
I love hand puppet Godzilla over the mountains. That's such a fun scene.
The first time I saw Godzilla, it was exactly like when I saw King Kong. He was goofy looking as hell.
And we see Gojira's head roaring above the mountain.
The black and white does him a lot of favors, particularly in the scenes at night, but it's clearly just this crummy foam suit that someone's wearing.
It's, they did what they could at the time. I don't think the suit is bad, but there's just something about that look in his eyes that makes me laugh every time I see it. And
it was like a squash Oscar the Grouch.
It's a little bit too goofy for that movie, to be honest.
After it disappears again, the camera lingers on the beach where we see footprints and the imprint of a tail leading back to the sea.
Yeah, that's a goofy moment. There's some goofy little hiccups in editing. I'm never sure if it's because of the transfer. Some people blame bad continuity editing or on things that weren't necessarily in the original film, but I'm wondering if whatever print they had some sort of weird glitch with it. There's some weird awkward editing moments in every version of the movie I've ever seen is when Emiko stands up. She stands up twice in a certain spot. You get to see some strings on Godzilla's tail every once in a while through the smoke. Yeah, there's some goofy moments. But this is just after the Japanese were allowed to have, freedom of expression again, and Toho was no longer being used as a propaganda tool by the US government, and they were basically left on their own again, and they were trying to make this movie in a hurry. And it's actually pretty fantastic how good it is, considering how short a time they made this movie. And from the time that they started writing the script to the end of the process was a year. Might have even been less than a year. And they had a similar time constraint with the second Godzilla film, Godzilla Raids Again, and I gotta tell you, they did not deliver with the second one. What should have happened with the first movie is what happened with the second movie. in terms of quality. So yeah, there's a lot of goofy stuff here. It's but despite that, the movie's able to overcome a lot of that stuff.
So the paleontologist gives his slideshow presentation, and he claims that the creature is from the Jurassic period. But he mistakenly says that the Brontosaurus is from 2 million years ago. His hypothesis is that Gojira, the creature from Moto Island folklore, is an evolutionary descendant of sea-dwelling dinosaurs. Godzilla is established at 500 meters tall, which is huge, by the way.
Okay, I'm a little pissed that they severely misrepresented Godzilla's size in 56. OG Godzilla is only 50 meters or 164 feet tall. They say over 400 feet, which is over 2.4 times difference. That would make this Godzilla the second largest in the entire franchise, second only to Godzilla Earth, who is about 1,000 feet tall.
Apparently Godzilla and other ancient creatures have been surviving deep underground, but nuclear activity altered their natural habitat. Basically, an atomic bomb test unleashed Godzilla on the world.
So they took out a lot of the darker elements, a lot of the stuff that is meant to be more of a direct parallel to the atomic bombs going off in Japan.
Those sun scenes are cut or shortened. It can be argued that this frequently improves the film's pacing.
In the Japanese version, there's a lot more debate over the international implications of the truth getting out.
So to have all of these elements really speaking to the ideas behind this, and all behind the veil of a giant monster, coming up and destroying everything, it's such a great way to present a metaphor like this. And all great movies who use metaphors correctly are classics. Planet of the Apes would be another one I could think of right off the top of my head. 1968, by the way, where they use great metaphors, metaphorical speech about everything that's happening in the world, but through the lens of apes and ape culture, and it reflects right. This does the very same thing, where it takes this outlandish concept, but rooted in so much reality that you get it.
In the 56 version, after Yamane talks about the history of dinosaurs, there's an awkward scene where a woman shouts out and is neither dubbed nor explained, it just kind of moves on. The 54 version is much longer and involves the public speaking out against their leaders. God knows democracy isn't about listening to the voice of the people, so all of that was removed. Our soft American ears weren't ready to hear about such ideas yet.
It really plays up the radioactive angle, throughout. It hits you over the head with it. This is a metaphor.
But I'll leave it up to you if it's worth losing almost 20 minutes of footage.
So the Coast Guard fires off depth charges to try and rid Japan of the creature.
Now, as far as Emiko goes and Ogata, they are the rational characters, in a manner of speaking. They're speaking to everyone else. They don't want to be involved, but they do want to be involved.
If you're wondering why the kid from Odo Island is just now suddenly with the Yamane household, he was adopted. That's not explained in either version.
The paleontologist, Emiko's father, is depressed and doesn't want them to destroy Godzilla. There's literally a scene of him just sitting in the dark, and he's like, "Leave me alone."
It's almost like when you see him lamenting over them wanting to kill and not study, it's almost like if we can study him, we can figure out how to harness his power and prevent us from ever being damaged by atom bombs ever again. It's almost like that's where his thought process goes. And even though the idea is far-fetched in the sense that they would ever be hit with it again, they don't know. They're living that. We don't think about, we'll get hit with an atom bomb tomorrow or the next day. There's always that fear, but we're not thinking about it. They've been there. Why couldn't it happen again? So I understand where he's coming from and why he's so distraught about it, because he sees this as an opportunity. It's not about Godzilla. It's about what he can bring, what he can actually give to the people of Japan outside of destruction.
Cut to a shot of Tokyo nightlife in the 50s. We then see a cruise ship off the coast and hear a thudding in the distance. All of a sudden, Godzilla's head appears out of the water. I love this shot.
One thing that annoyed me, they kept talking about how Godzilla was in Tokyo Bay, and then he walked out and then slowly down. Later on, we see him walking around underwater. The problem is that Godzilla's 400 feet tall, and Tokyo Bay is only 230 feet deep. His head would literally always be out of the water.
For me, the biggest weakness in this movie is that there's not another monster. King Kong, I didn't realize in King Kong that we were going to get dinosaurs, but having seen that and then going to Godzilla, there's no opposition to Godzilla. He doesn't fight another monster that gives him any challenge. He doesn't, even humans don't give him a challenge. It
is very much like most monster movies from the 1950s, where you see a lot of people just sitting around worrying. But the movie is very much obviously like a response or a statement on the dangers of nuclear testing and the bomb, and of course the destruction of the bomb. Obviously Japan is uniquely situated to comment on that.
I don't know. I guess it's kind of like the point of the movie is, look at this monster who's so powerful he can just rampage across anything humanity tries to do to stop him. But it ended up leaving the movie feel a little bland to me, because Godzilla was such an unstoppable threat that I wasn't super engaged with it, I guess.
Now, it's really needs to be stated how effective the human drama is in the original movie. It's something that the series has strayed away from. Some of the better movies in the series actually do have better human drama. Invasion of Astro Monsters, another favorite of mine. That's probably the movie that Godzilla is in the least of any film in the series, but it has such a fun alien invasion storyline with a good cast of characters, and I enjoy that one as well.
But they are there to kind of be a gateway for the audience. You know, we have our thoughts, we have our understandings. But then you get into other characters who have a more important role in what they are trying to influence over the ideas being presented. Because with Dr. Yamane, he talks about he doesn't want to destroy Godzilla, he wants to study him. And if you really pay attention to why he's so interested in trying to study Godzilla, it's because Godzilla was created from the bomb, but he wasn't affected by it. Like, he had this immunity to what the atom bomb could do and the radiation he's able to absorb.
They ask the professor how to beat Godzilla. He says it's impossible, and that they should try to figure out how it survived so much radiation.
It's kind of the Superman problem, I think, where, like, Superman is so powerful that you have to incorporate some sort of weakness into a Superman story in order to make it interesting, either, through kryptonite or through him caring about Lois or caring about humanity in general. Like, you have to have that vulnerability in there, and Godzilla never had any vulnerability in this movie, and that made it less interesting to me, I suppose.
A reporter is sent to interview Dr. Serizawa and asks Emiko for help.
Emiko visits Serizawa to talk about Ogata, then Serizawa quickly shuts her down, like, "Hey, babe, I know you've got something really important to talk about, but come look at what I can do with science."
And then, obviously, Emiko just, he showed it to her because he was wanting to share his fear because they were going to get married.
Serizawa shows off his oxygen destroyer by disintegrating some fish in a tank, and creeps Emiko the hell out. The whole love story, secondary at best. And he's afraid of what it will do.
And kind of his moral dilemma there.
So when you see him in that conflict, that's real conflict coming from, I'm sure, the very same questions that these other scientists had. And they may very well have had those conversations like, I know what this can do, but I don't really feel like it's a great idea. And then you get people in charge who want to harness that and use it for weaponization purposes, and they use it, and you see what it has wrought.
Besides the horror of the images that we see that look like radiation and nuclear holocaust sort of deal, the other side of that human story between those three characters, and especially Dr. Serizawa and his final sacrifice at the end, that I think is the thing that grounds the film, and definitely the best character, the most interesting character in the movie is Dr. Serizawa.